Hello again, Econ 160, and welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about how to use supply and demand to make predictions about the market. So in the previous lecture, we introduced ourselves to the concepts of supply and demand in competitive markets, and we learned how they work together to determine equilibrium price and quantity in the market. And so we're now ready to use those ideas to analyze how markets respond to changing conditions. So this is a very practical lesson. Mastering these ideas will help you understand and maybe even predict how different world events are going to shape market outcomes. So whether you end up becoming a stock trader or an entrepreneur or a business analyst, or just someone who wants a better handle of what's going on in the world around them, this lecture will be relevant for you. Here are today's learning outcomes. By mastering today's lecture, you should be able to 1. Use supply and demand diagrams to predict how changes in market conditions will affect equilibrium price and quantity in a market. 2. Discuss the types of things that could cause supply and demand curves to change. 3. Explain what normal and inferior goods are and identify examples of normal and inferior goods. And finally, explain what complements and substitutes are and identify examples of complements and substitutes. So let's start with an example that shows what happens when demand increases. So this diagram on the right shows the initial supply and demand curves for coffee. And based on these initial supply and demand curves, the initial price is $2.50 and the initial quantity traded is 250,000, right? But we suppose then that one day scientists discover that coffee actually has great health benefits. In fact, let's suppose that scientists are now recommending that everyone should be drinking coffee daily. And the question we're going to ask is, assuming nothing else about the market is changing, how does this discovery affect the market for coffee? Well, the first thing we have to note is that because people now think that coffee is healthier, more people are going to want to drink coffee. And what that should do is that it should shift the demand curve to the right? It's going to shift the demand curve like this. And what's happening is that at each price level, the quantity demanded is increasing, right? And for this particular shift, it's showing that for every price level, the quantity is increasing by 100,000. So if we look at $4 here, the initial demand curve shows that quantity demanded was 100,000, and the new demand curve shows that the quantity demanded was 200,000, right? So at every price level, an additional 100,000 quantity is being demanded. And so what does this do to the price and quantity of coffee? Well, we'll simply look at where the new demand curve intersects the supply curve, and we see that price went from $2.50 in the old equilibrium to $3 in the new equilibrium, and quantity went from 250K in the old equilibrium to 300K in the new equilibrium, okay? So our answer is that price increased from $2.50 to $3 and that quantity increased from 250,000 to 300,000. All right, we can also ask what happens in a market when demand decreases. So again, here's the initial supply and demand curve in the market for coffee. It's the same as in the previous example. But this time, instead of discovering that coffee is good for you, this time scientists discover that coffee causes cancer. All right, so we're going to ask, what does this do to the market for coffee, assuming nothing else about the market is changing? Well, first of all, it's going to decrease the demand for coffee, right? And that means the demand curve is going to shift left like this. Okay, and in this particular case, you can see that at each price level, the quantity demanded actually decreases by 100,000 at each price level. Okay, and so what does this do to the price and quantity of coffee? Well, to answer that, we just compare the new equilibrium to the old equilibrium, and we see that price went from $2.50 in the old equilibrium to $2 in the new equilibrium, and we see that quantity fell from 250K in the old equilibrium to 200K in the new equilibrium, okay? And so this is what could happen when the demand curve is decreasing. So in these two examples, we showed exactly how much the demand curve changed at each price level, and we knew exactly what the supply and demand curves were. And so that allowed us to make what's called a quantitative prediction about how price and quantity would change, all right? And quantitative prediction is just a fancy way of saying a prediction about the actual numbers for price and quantity. But there's an issue here, which is that in real life, it can actually be really difficult to know exactly how much supply or demand will change in response to an event. Not to mention, it's pretty hard to even know what the supply and the demand curve are. And we might talk a little bit about how people try to do that later on in the course. But oftentimes, even if we don't know the numbers, we can know the direction of a change. And moreover, we also know that supply is generally upward sloping and demand is generally downward sloping. And by simply knowing these few facts, even if we don't know the actual numbers, we can still make a qualitative prediction about what happens to price and quantity, all right? And qualitative is just a fancy way of saying a prediction about the direction of how things are going to change without putting an actual number on it. So let's give an example of that. Suppose that doctors discover a new medicinal use for cannabis, and assuming that nothing else about the market is changing, what does this do to price and quantity in the cannabis market? All right, so to do this, we're going to start by drawing a generic supply and demand curve in the market for cannabis, okay? And then we're going to ask, what does the event that we're analyzing do to either supply or demand? Well, since with a new medicinal use, demand for cannabis is going to increase, which means a rightward shift in the demand curve, like so. Then if we compare the new equilibrium to the old equilibrium, right, we can say that price is higher, so price went up. And we can say that quantity is higher, right, so quantity went up. And so this is our qualitative prediction that when doctors discover a new use for cannabis, price is going to increase and quantity is going to increase. Let's do one more example. Instead of discovering a new medicinal use, suppose that doctors actually discover that cannabis is a lot more harmful and addictive than initially thought. What's this going to do to the market for cannabis? Well, let's start by drawing a supply and a demand curve in the market for cannabis. And then we're going to ask, what does this event do to either supply or demand? Well, it's going to decrease the demand curve, right? Which means a leftward shift like so, okay? And then as we compare the new equilibrium to the old equilibrium, we can see that price went down, okay? And quantity also went down. All right, so that's our qualitative prediction. Now, before moving on, I want to address an issue about language because there's something that sometimes confuses students, and I want to make sure that things are clear. All right, so here's the issue. So something we saw is that when demand increases and supply stays the same, then price goes up and quantity goes up, right? And that's illustrated by what's happening here, right? Demand increases, supply stays the same, price goes up, and quantity goes up, right? And so equilibrium quantity went up, and that means that both the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied actually went up in the new equilibrium, right? Because in the equilibrium, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, okay? But here's the problem. How can we say that supply stayed the same if the equilibrium quantity supplied actually went up? So do you see the confusion? We started off by saying that demand increases and supply stays the same, but we ended up showing that actually both quantity supplied and quantity demanded increased. So what gives? The answer is that when economists say demand increased or supply stayed the same, we're usually referring to the entire demand curve and the entire supply curve. So when I say that demand increased and supply stayed the same, what I mean is that the demand curve increased, or the whole curve shifted to the right, and that the supply curve stayed the same. And just because the supply curve stays the same doesn't necessarily mean that the quantity supplied is staying the same, right? Because prices are also changing in the new equilibrium. So even with the same supply curve, you can get the quantity supplied changing, right? And so generally, if I want to refer to quantity supplied changing, then I'll just say quantity supplied. I wouldn't use the word just supply, okay? And same thing with demand versus quantity demanded. So I just wanted to clear that up in case anyone gets confused by the language that we're using. So now let's talk about things that can shift the demand curve. And the first thing that can shift the demand curve that we're going to talk about is consumers' incomes. Right? When a consumer's income changes, then their demand curve is going to change as well. And that makes a lot of sense, right? So think of yourself, for example. If your salary increases, then your demand for eating out at nice restaurants is probably going to increase as well, right? Because what that's saying is that at any given restaurant price level, when you get richer, you're going to want to eat out more often. And that's the case for most goods, right? Which is that the demand for a good is going to increase when the consumer's income goes up. And if that's the case for a good, then we call that good a normal good, okay? And most goods are normal goods because for most goods, you're going to demand more of it when you get richer. But it's also possible for demand to decrease when incomes go up, okay? And when that's the case, we call the good an inferior good. Right? Inferior goods are not as common as normal goods, but they do exist, right? There are things that people tend to demand less of when they get richer. So what are some examples of inferior goods? Well, there are certain consumer staples, like potatoes, that sometimes behave like inferior goods because as you get richer, you prefer to eat more expensive and fancier foods. Similarly, discount and off-brand products like cheap instant coffee versus real coffee, or discount stores versus higher-end stores might be considered inferior goods because people move away from those things towards higher quality products as they get richer. The second thing that can shift demand curves that we'll talk about is the price of related goods. So demand for a good can change when the prices of other goods change. And here's an example. If the price of video game consoles goes up, then that's probably going to affect the demand for video games, right? And how the price of a related good affects another good's demand depends on whether those two goods are substitutes or complements. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. First, when two goods are usually purchased together, then we call those good complements, okay? So complements are goods that tend to be used together to achieve some purpose, all right? So what are some examples of complements? Well, coffee and milk are complements because they usually go together. Another example would be video game consoles and video games. Those two kind of have to go together. And the important thing to remember about complements is that when the price of a good goes up, the demand for its complements will decrease, okay, and vice versa. Right, so think of it this way. If the price of a video game console goes up, then demand for its complement, the video games, is going to decrease, right? And that happens because complements go together. So if the price of one of them goes up, people are going to want less of the thing that goes together with it, okay? Now, the opposite of complements is substitutes. So when two goods are used as alternatives to each other, meaning they tend to serve a similar function and can be replaced by the other, then we call those goods substitutes, all right? So what are some examples of substitutes? Well, coffee and tea could be substitutes since they serve a similar purpose and they can act as replacements for each other. But of course, some coffee drinkers like myself would disagree that tea is an appropriate substitute for coffee. But here's a much better example, all right? PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, these are definitely substitutes, right? They serve the same purpose, they're direct alternatives to each other, and very few people would ever need to own both. So the key thing to remember about substitutes is that when the price of a good goes up, then demand for its substitutes is going to increase, right? And vice versa. So think of it this way, if the price of a PS4 goes up, right, then demand for the Xbox is actually going to increase because people are going to switch away from buying PS4s and towards buying Xboxes, okay? All right, so now let's talk about a couple of other things that can shift the demand curve, all right? The third thing that we're going to talk about is consumer tastes, right? So changes in consumer tastes can shift the demand curve. And in fact, most of the examples that we gave so far, where, like coffee was shown to be either good or bad for your health, those are examples of things that change consumer tastes. We won't say much more about consumer tastes other than just the fact that experience shows that consumer taste can be very hard to predict. The fourth thing that can shift demand curves is the number of consumers, right? So even if tastes stay the same, the prices of related goods stay the same, incomes aren't changing, demand can still change if simply the number of consumers is changing, right? And so, of course, generally speaking, if we have more consumers, then that's going to translate to more demand, assuming everything else is staying the same. And finally, the fifth thing to always remember is that people's expectations about the future can also affect their demand, right? And I'll just give you one example of how that might happen. If consumers expect car prices to increase in the near future, then they may opt to buy cars now, right? To buy it before the prices increase. And that would affect the demand for cars today. So in economics, there's always a very interesting interplay between what happens in the present and people's expectations about the future. We won't talk too much about how to think about expectations in this class, but just keep in mind that expectations about the future can affect demand and supply curves in the present. All right, so far we've only really talked about what happens when demand curves change. And so now let's talk about what happens when supply curves change. The method that we approach this from is really going to be the same, so it's equally easy and straightforward. So here's an example. Let's say farmers one day discover a new way to grow coffee that allows them to produce more coffee and at lower cost. Assuming that nothing else about the market is changing, what does this do to price and quantity in the market for coffee? So to answer this question, we're going to start by drawing a supply and demand curve in the market for coffee. Okay, and then we're going to ask, what does this event do to either the supply or the demand curve? And since this is an event which is affecting the suppliers, and it's actually reducing the cost for suppliers, right? And what that means is that at any price level, they're going to be willing to supply more. So it should increase the supply curve, which means a rightward shift in the supply curve like this, right? And so then we just have to look at how the equilibrium changes, all right? So we can see that price goes down, but that quantity goes up, all right? So this is what happens when supply is increasing. So now let's do an example where the supply curve is decreasing. So a cold snap destroys a portion of the coffee crop. Assuming nothing else about the market is changing, what does this do to the market for coffee? All right, so we're going to start by drawing a supply and a demand curve. And we note that since a portion of the coffee crop is destroyed, that's just going to reduce the amount of quantity at any given price. And so the supply curve will shift left like so. Okay, and so then we compare the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium, and we see that price went up. Okay, price went up and quantity went down, right? So hopefully that was easy and straightforward to you, and that you can see how analyzing changes to the supply curve is very similar to analyzing changes to the demand curve. But now let's talk about things that can shift the supply curve, all right? So the first thing we're going to talk about is input prices. All right, so producers need inputs such as human labor, or capital, or materials, or energy, etc., in order to produce outputs. And what that means is that the price of these inputs is going to affect their costs. And since the supply curve is equal to the marginal cost curve, right, we talked about that in the last lecture, then higher input prices implies higher marginal costs, which means a decreased supply curve, right? And so changes to input prices can affect the supply curve. The second thing is productivity and technology, right? So if productivity goes up, and when we say productivity, economists mean that when productivity goes up, it means that the firm can produce more outputs given the same number of inputs, right? So that's what we mean by productivity, which is the amount of output you can produce for the same number of inputs. And so when productivity goes up, what that means is that at any level of price, suppliers are going to be willing to supply more. And so this is going to increase the supply curve, right? So increased productivity increases the supply curve. How can productivity increase? The most common way is due to technological advances, right? When we invent new types of machinery or new types of software or new types of processes that increase our productivity, that's how productivity goes up. Another way is through increases in human skill, right? So as someone spends more time working on a particular problem, they start to be able to solve those kinds of problems much faster, and their productivity goes up, all right? So technology and skill are two of the main ways that productivity increases. So a third thing that can change the supply curve is simply the number of producers, right? Other things equal, right? Even if input prices stay the same, even if productivity and technology stays the same, if we have more producers, we're going to have more supply, right? And in fact, later in the course, we're actually going to think very carefully about how numbers of producers can change over time, okay? And finally, the fourth thing to always remember, like I said, is expectations about the future can affect the supply curve today. And here's just a simple example. If a car dealership expects car prices to go up in the near future, then what are they going to do today? They're going to be less willing to sell at today's prices, right? They're going to be less willing to sell and more willing to keep cars in inventory in order to wait for the higher prices tomorrow. And what that does is that it reduces the amount of supply today, right? And so just another reminder, expectations about the future can affect the supply curve today. In all the previous examples, we only looked at demand or supply changing on their own. And so now we're going to do a series of examples where supply and demand are changing at the same time. And what we're going to see is that when supply and demand are both changing at the same time, things get just a little bit more complicated, okay? But again, the approach is the same. So for this slide, we're going to be looking at when supply and demand are both increasing. And in fact, what happens actually depends on two possible scenarios, okay? So in scenario one, we have the demand curve increasing by a lot and the supply curve increasing by a little. And so in this scenario, we see that the old equilibrium is here and the new equilibrium is here. So price went up and quantity went up, okay? So that's scenario A. In scenario B, the demand curve goes up by a little and the supply curve goes up by a lot, okay? And so what happens? The old equilibrium is here, the new equilibrium is here, and so this time price actually goes down, but quantity goes up, right? So in scenario A, price and quantity both go up. In scenario B, price goes down, but quantity goes up. So what can we say when supply and demand are both increasing? We can say that quantity definitely is going to go up, but the effect on price could go either way, and it depends on the degree to which the supply and the demand curves are moving, okay? So now let's look at the case where demand is increasing, but supply is decreasing. And again, we're going to have two scenarios. In the first scenario, demand increases by a lot, and supply decreases by a little. And if you look at the two equilibria, you can see that price goes up and quantity also goes up. In scenario B, demand goes up by a little, but supply goes down by a lot. All right, and if you look at the two equilibria, you see that price went up, but quantity actually went down this time, right? So in scenario A, price went up and quantity went up. In scenario B, price went up and quantity went down. So what can we say when demand increases and supply decreases? We can say that price is definitely going to go up, but that the effect on quantity could go either way. And now let's look at what happens when demand decreases and supply increases. Again, two scenarios. In scenario one, the demand decreases by a lot, but supply increases by a little. and we can see that price goes down and quantity also goes down. In scenario B, demand goes down by a little, supply goes up by a lot, and what you can see is that price goes down, but quantity goes up. Okay, so what can we say about when demand is decreasing and supply is increasing? We can say that the price is definitely going to go down, but the effect on quantity could go either way. And finally, let's see what happens when supply and demand are both decreasing. All right, in scenario A, demand decreases by a lot, supply decreases by a little, and what you can see is that price and quantity both go down. All right. In scenario B, demand decreases by a little, supply decreases by a lot, and you can see that this time price went up, but quantity went down. All right. So what can we say when supply and demand are both decreasing? Well, we can say that quantity is definitely going to go down, but that the effect on price could go either way. So that was kind of a lot to go through, and it might seem counterintuitive because we saw that when demand changes by itself or when supply changes by itself, we can make a prediction about both what happens to price and what happens to quantity. But we see that when demand and supply are changing simultaneously, we can really only say something about one of them, either price or quantity, and the effect on the other one is going to be unknown. And so why is that? So the reason that happens is because when demand increases, then this has the effect of wanting to push up both the price and the quantity. But on the other hand, when supply increases, this has the tendency of wanting to push down the price, right? But push up the quantity. So if they both increase, if both supply and demand are increasing, what happens is the effect on quantity, they work together in the same direction, right? They work together to push quantity up. But then the effect on prices actually work against each other, right? The supply increase wants to push prices down, and the demand increase wants to push prices up. And so they can counteract each other. And whether prices go up or down depends on the relative size of the two forces, okay? And so a similar thing happens when supply and demand move in opposite directions, right? Then their effect on price is going to work together, but their effect on quantity is going to counteract each other, okay? And so here's a handy table which tells you for whatever is happening to supply and demand, what we can say about the equilibrium price and quantity, right? So if demand and supply are both increasing, then we can say that the quantity increases, but the effect on price is going to be unknown. On the other hand, if demand is decreasing and supply is increasing, then we can say that the equilibrium price will decrease, but the effect on quantity is unknown, okay? And now before you kind of despair at this table, let me tell you straight up, do not memorize this table, okay? It's not meant for memorization. This is just a handy reference in case you ever want to double check something. You really shouldn't be memorizing this table. Instead, you should be confident in your ability to use the supply and demand diagrams to figure these things out for yourself, just being aware that sometimes you might have to consider two scenarios, okay? So one motto for this class is that you just want to keep calm and think logically, okay? Think about what's going to happen to the supply and the demand curve. Use the supply and demand diagram to plot out what happens and compare the equilibria. Just keeping in mind that when supply and demand are moving simultaneously, you might have to consider two different scenarios, okay? So keep calm and think logically. Don't memorize the table. It's probably too much to memorize. In order to help you to keep calm and think logically, let me now just tell you the 3 steps to analyzing how a market responds to an event so that you can approach any scenario that you want in a methodical fashion. Step number 1 is you first want to determine if the event affects the supply curve or the demand curve or both. Step number 2, you want to determine in which direction the supply and the demand curves shift. And step 3, you want to draw the supply and demand diagram with both the old and the new supply and demand curves, and then you're going to use the diagram to predict what happens to equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, so very simple 3-step approach. to analyzing changes to market conditions, okay? And so before we finish, I do just want to give one caveat for everything that we did today, which is that, remember, we're still in the context of competitive markets, right? And so the closer a market is to satisfying our definitions of a competitive market, the better this approach is going to work, right? So if the market is very competitive, then our approach here of analyzing how supply and demand affects prices and quantities in the market, it should work pretty well. But if the market is not at all competitive, right? Let's say there's only one supplier, or let's say that buyers and sellers are not price takers, then using supply and demand in this way might not actually be appropriate, okay? And instead, we're going to be looking at how to analyze other kinds of markets in later lectures in this course. All right, so here's a quick review. In order to predict how an event is going to affect equilibrium price and quantity in a market, what we first do is determine how it affects the supply and demand curves, and then we use a supply and demand diagram to see how the equilibrium changes. We can make both quantitative and qualitative predictions depending on how much we know about the supply and the demand curves and how much we know about the size of the changes. Many different things can cause demand curves to change, including consumer incomes, prices of related goods, consumer tastes, number of consumers, and expectations about the future. And many different things can cause the supply curve to change, including input prices, productivity and technology, the number of producers, and again, expectations about the future. Okay? And then the last three are just definitions of different types of goods, which are useful for this kind of analysis, especially on the demand side. So if a demand for a good increases when consumer incomes increase, then we say that good is a normal good. And if demand for a good decreases when consumer incomes increase, then we say that good is an inferior good. Okay? If two goods go together, we call them complements. And when the price of a good goes up, what happens is that the demand for its complements is going to decrease. If two goods are alternatives or replacements for each other, then we call them substitutes. And when the price of a good goes up, then the demand for its substitutes will increase. Okay? All right, so that's it for today's lecture. Thank you for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you guys next time.